My name's Brett Vaughan. I'm from the Melbourne Medical School and in particular the Department of Medical Education. So my background is as an osteopath. I am still in private practice a day and a half or 2 days a week, working here in the Department of Medical Education for another 2.5 days, as well as doing my PhD in clinical education, and particularly clinical education and allowing our students to evaluate us as teachers. So I suppose that's where my background is. Through the presentation today, if you've got any questions, feel free to speak up or pop a question in the chat window as well. We'll try and get to all of those questions at some point during our little webinar today. So, being good educators, we always have some sort of learning objective or objectives for our session. And so really what we're going to do today is talk through the challenging learner. So how we might identify the challenging learner, some of the, I've termed human factors and system issues that might lead that particular learner to become our challenging learner. We'll look at some of the strategies that you might be able to use to help with managing that challenging learner, documenting the goals that you've and designing that learning plan and that learning contract. And if anyone is, as I said, got any questions at any point throughout, or if you've got examples that you want to discuss, please feel free to jump in and contribute those to the discussion as well. So let's have a look at identifying the challenging learner. So this particular table is from a paper by Yvonne Steiner back in 2013. But even though it was a little while ago now, I reckon these are some really great questions. And it really gets us to think about whose problem actually is it? And I think this is a question that we don't really ask ourselves all that often when we're dealing with the challenging learner. It might be that, as we said, it's actually not our problem. It's actually someone else's problem. It might be the learner's problem themselves that they need to manage. And how we go about contributing to that discussion is a really interesting point. So I want to work our way through this table a bit. And I think as I go through posing these questions, what I hope is that it does actually stimulate some thinking in your mind about examples of when you've had a challenging learner. So first of all, this idea of going from intuition to problem identification. So the first question there is probably the really obvious one, which is, what is the problem? So is it a problem with the learner's hands-on or clinical skill performance? Is it their communication? Is it their professionalism? Or is it actually, it's just a personality clash between you and that particular learner? And that's not necessarily that uncommon. So I reckon it's a really great problem as we step back and go, right, I perceive this learner to be a problem, but what is the problem? If you can make that crystal clear in your own mind, it actually makes things a little bit easier to manage that particular scenario, whether it's you managing it yourself as the educator or assisting the learner to manage that as well. The second question there I really like is, whose problem is it? And I don't think we ask ourselves this question enough. There are certainly times where it is a problem for both us as the educator and also the learner at the same time. But then there's also scenarios where it's purely in the learner's court. So the problem is actually something potentially that's extraneous to their clinical placement that's going on. That might be family or social issues that could be playing a part in that. And they're things that you may not be able to have a significant influence over beyond providing them with a bit of support. The third question also is a really good one to ask too. And this one, is it a problem that must be changed? Now, clearly there are problems that must be changed. So for example, if patient safety is at risk, then clearly that's going to be a problem that we absolutely need to change and we need to address. But there are some things which are actually, if we come back to that idea of a personality clash between us and the learner, that problem is more about being managed rather than being changed. So hopefully, though, even those three questions have just started to get you thinking about the problem learner. What is the problem? Whose problem is it? And does it actually need to be changed? So I reckon there's some great questions to actually just have a think about as we're going through this. Then this next series of questions is really around going from, okay, we've identified there is a problem here, to the actual definition of what this problem is. So you'll actually see there is some overlap between this idea of, oh, actually, yeah, I think there's a problem here, to what is the actual problem. So really distilling down as much as you can what this problem is. So thinking about, or going through the examples that may well be running through your mind at the moment is, can you actually narrow it down to what the problem is that that learner is creating for you, it's creating for themselves, or creating for both of you as the learner and educator? Really interesting question is to get some insight into the learner's perception of the problem. So we're assuming there is actually a problem here. Now, this can be really instructive because this is where you start to get into this idea of particularly the overconfident learner. So the learner's got this really, I won't say quite warped perception, but they've certainly got a very different perception of their strengths and weaknesses. They may not even perceive this to be a problem. And so that can be a significant way to get some insight into the way they're thinking about this particular scenario. If they see it is a problem, like they, particularly the underconfident learner will often see everything as a problem, and it's a problem that they've got to try and fix. And potentially they may not even know how to go about fixing it, but they know they've got to fix it. And so sometimes even that is, it's actually not a problem. They're actually doing really well. It's all you need to do is actually, as the educator, is provide them with a little bit of support and some guidance to help build up their confidence. So it's not particularly a problem per se. It's more, again, that insight and that confidence that the underconfident learner just needs to develop. And so that positive reinforcement can be really valuable. So that follows to our next question there about what are the learner's perceived strengths and weaknesses. So again, you can see all of the questions here at the moment are really directed towards the learner. What is it that they're thinking this problem is about? What are they doing well? What do they need assistance with? Or what might they be struggling with at this point in time? The next question is around that life history. Now, this is a bit more of a challenging one, particularly for us as educators, where we don't, or we may not necessarily see these students for any great length of time. We might only see them for a 3 or 4 week block, but we need to try and develop a little bit of a rapport and a bit of an understanding about this student, what their relevant background is. So is it that they've gone to a rural placement because they're actually really interested in rural practice? They've got a family from a rural background. Is it someone who's been in the city all of their life? They've moved up to the rural setting and they're now removed from their friends and family, and they're actually just struggling with that social aspect of being away from friends and family. So that can be just, even those sorts of things can give you a bit of an idea more so about why they might have become a problem or a challenge, and some of the influences on what you might be able to do, or the limits to what you might be able to achieve in helping that learner along. The next question really then focuses back on us as the educator. So we're looking here, first up, is really what are our strengths and weaknesses as clinical educators? So look, ideally, yeah, I don't like the use of the word weakness. I don't think it really describes accurately that scenario. It's always, for me, a thing that, what can we do to improve as an educator? There are things that absolutely we'll be doing really well, And there are things that we will absolutely be wanting to improve. And partly you coming along to the webinar today is you're actually wanting to improve your ability to manage the problem learner or the challenging learner. The other part here as well, which I reckon is really interesting, and again, we don't pay a lot of attention to, is the system in which we work. There's a lot of influences on clinical education that go beyond just us as the educator and the student. So we're all doing this as part of a university, so there's going to be university structures around this. You're doing your work as a clinician in the Golden Valley Health Service. So there are going to be system issues around that, about how you have to interact with that system. And then how do those things influence your teaching and your learning with that student and how that student learns as well? Sometimes the actual challenge, or where this learner becomes the challenging learner, is actually a system issue which is a lot bigger than what you're able to potentially influence or have any control over. So you may not actually be able to do a lot. And often what we see is educators get into the scenario where if the system's the issue, they'll actually get really hung up on trying to change something really quickly and get that learner back on track. But we actually just can't do it that quickly because of the structure of the system that's around us. If you're in that really valuable scenario of having other colleagues that you work with in your clinical education and they have the same learners, asking them what their perception of that particular learner is, what their level of performance is, whether they perceive them to be a challenge, can be really instructive as well. So is it that actually, no, they were fine with that particular educator? Was it the fact that they got along really well? So personality-wise, it worked really well. Was it a slightly different placement? So it might have been an area of practice actually that they're really interested in doing, whereas they're coming to you, for example, not putting down aged care here, but a lot of students don't want to do necessarily aged care stuff. So they come into an aged care placement. It's not something that they're really interested in or engaged in. And so they just go through the motions. They're not engaged in it at all. And so they become a bit of a challenge in trying to motivate them. And so the actual context in which that placement's occurring can be really important as well. So chatting with your colleagues, particularly if they're in another area of your clinical education practice, that can be really helpful to help you frame where this problem might be. So hopefully that's all starting to make sense to you. And really, as I said, these initial questions are really designed to get you thinking about globally, what's the problem? Whose problem is it? What are the strengths and the weaknesses of us as the educator? What's the learner's strengths and weaknesses? And what are the system's strengths and weaknesses as well? So we're looking at it from multiple viewpoints. The next part really gets into the guts of it. So we've got to this point where we know that there is actually an issue with this particular learner. Now, we haven't said whether it's an underperforming learner, it's an overconfident learner, or they've got some sort of extraneous challenge. We're just saying there's a problem here. So what's the problem that we're actually trying to address? And we talked about the example of a system issue, which realistically we may not be able to address in any great depth. We could try and work our way around it. That might be helpful. But really, if we can solve it, or to an extent at least contribute to solving that problem ourselves, then we really want to try and narrow down again that problem that we're actually trying to address. What's going to be the outcome of us as the educator addressing this issue? So is it to change a behaviour? Is it to change a set of behaviours? Is it to change a set of communication strategies? Is it to change the student's competency with a set of clinical skills? Try and narrow down the problem. If it's just I want to make this person better or be a better clinical better health professional, that's a pretty significant problem to try and solve. And one person being you is probably not going to make a massive difference to that. How are you going to address the identified problem? And we're actually going to talk through some strategies how you might do that. And again, thinking about the scenarios that you've been in, where you've had the challenging learner, what sort of things have you done to try and address this? Who's going to be involved in it? Now, in the ideal world, we would have multiple people involved in this. And it should be beyond you as just a clinical educator. Oops, sorry, jumping ahead there. What's the time frame? So is this something that we can do straight away? Is it a really easy fix that we can solve this problem straight away just by having a very quick chat with that learner, potentially pointing them towards some resources, potentially modelling the practice that we want them to do? Or is it a longer term problem that we may have to address over a number of weeks or over a number of placements as well? How are we going to document the intervention and evaluate it? So the evaluation is really looking at the success or otherwise of the interventions that we've put in place. Has it changed the behaviour? Has it changed the ability of that learner to perform that particular skill? Documentation is hugely important, particularly nowadays where we're seeing a lot more appreciation of bullying and the potential for bullying as well. And so one of the key considerations as educators is we need to be mindful that we're not perceived to be bullying the learner into something, or that we're not picking on them in any way, shape or form. So our documentation should follow from our choice of language when we're working with the learner around this area, where our language really needs to be very neutral. It's about documenting standards and performance against those standards and giving the learner the opportunity to change or to improve. The last one there is how will the process be assured? And so really what we're talking about here is who are those other people that are going to be involved in it? And so ideally we're looking at who's involved in the clinical placement for that learner. So it might be the administrators of that clinical placement. It may be the academics who are overseeing that clinical placement as well, who you need to have involved in this process. They can potentially help you manage that particular learner, but also assure the process and ensure that the learner has the best opportunity to change and to address the problem that you've actually identified. So as you can see, there's a fair number of questions to think about beyond just the I've got a problem with this learner or this learner has a problem with X. There's actually quite a bit underneath it that ideally we really want to be thinking about before jumping in the deep end to try and address it. And you'll see why in a little bit more detail in a moment. So let's look at why a learner may actually become a challenge. And again, some of these may resonate with the examples that you've got in your own mind. So the first example there is not knowing the standards, the goals, or the expectations for this particular placement. If you ask the learners what they're wanting to get out of the placement, they may not actually know. They may not even know what the placement's about. And so one of the really good ways of, in a way, sort of heading off some of these issues is actually getting a really good sense of what the learner understands about the placement. What is it that they're actually going to see or do? What they're expected to do? What your expectations of them are? And conversely, what the student's expectation of you is going to be as well is a really important thing. We'll talk about that one in a little bit more detail in a second. There's also this idea of the lack of insight into their own behaviour. And lack of insight is a pretty significant thing as well. So here we're talking about the learner who is potentially overconfident, they may not have an insight into the fact that their behaviour is actually unprofessional. Their mannerisms or the way that they're dealing with patients is not professional on any level, or there are things that they absolutely need to address and improve. There's also a lack of incentive. And so here we start to break it down into these ideas of intrinsic and extrinsic motivators. So if we look at extrinsic motivators are typically the whole reward around what's in it for me as the learner. So typically the extrinsic placement will be, what's the grade I'm going to get for this placement? What do I need to do to tick the boxes to get through this particular placement? How many patients or how many clients do I need to go and see? How many of a particular type of condition or complaint do I need to go and see? How many times do I need to take someone's blood pressure? They're all the things that are extrinsic motivators for the student. And so if those are the things that the placement is measured against, then you're really starting to reinforce this idea of extrinsic motivation. And so it then becomes a lack of incentive beyond actually all the student's going to do, or all that learner's going to do, is just go away and see their 20 clients because that's all they need to see. They're not actually going to take anything from a learning point of view out of it. The intrinsic motivation, however, is that classic of, I want to be a better health professional. I'm here to help people with their health and to get to better health. So my role as a learner is to try and learn how to do that and how to do that well, how to be professional, how to be an expert communicator, how to engage the patient in the process. They're all intrinsic motivators. And what we hope is that they're built up before they get to the placement, and the placement really reinforces those extrinsic motivators, and that the student's got an opportunity to actually put a lot of those things in place. And so that leads us to this next point around the lack of motivation for learning. So are there actually things built into this placement that motivate them to learn? We talked before about the example of the learner who may not want to do aged care as our example. And so there may not be a lot of motivation for them to go about learning for aged care because they don't perceive that that's an area that they're going to go into. And so that could be a significant thing that we need to address very early. There are clearly components of what we do in aged care that apply right across the board as health professionals, things like professionalism, communication strategies and the like, even an understanding of those conditions that affect older patients is a really important part of our practice. It may also be that there are actually external influences on why there is no motivation for their learning. So it might be that this student is actually struggling with other aspects of their life. And I'll talk about some of the external stresses in just a second. There is this potential for a lack of knowledge, skill, or competence. And I've no doubt that for those of you that have done clinical education for a while, you'll have had students who come in and you just go, really not sure where you're at or how did you get to the point of being at this placement. And unfortunately, our, again, systems of getting learners to their clinical placement may not have picked this up, or they may have actually got into that scenario where they've done just enough to keep getting through their assessments before they get to you and having to start really applying it in a clinical scenario. So these learners can be a challenge, but often they're actually a challenge for us as the educator because we're expected to try and bring up their level of skill, knowledge, or competence. There may also be a lack of opportunity to rehearse, practice, or engage with the content in the placement that you're looking after that's or supervising that student in. And so this comes back to setting up those goals and those expectations at the start of the placement. What realistically is the student actually going to see? What are they going to be able to do in this placement? So it might be completely unrealistic that some learners are going to be able to experience some conditions or to see those conditions compared to others in other placements. There may also be opportunities where we actually miss, as educators, an opportunity to, whether it be teach or allow the student to engage in content or a skill or the application of a skill that we do day in, day out, and we actually don't think about it as a teaching opportunity. So one of the things that I think we can reflect on as educators is what are the learning opportunities that we have in our daily practice for our learners that can sort of, in a way, contribute to them not becoming this challenging learner, but also really engaging them in those elements of what it is to be a health professional, and then tapping into our intrinsic motivators and really pushing them along as a student. External stress is another really important part to consider, and we tie this back with the lack of motivation for learning. Students nowadays, we know that they have part-time jobs, they're working quite a bit. If they've moved away from home to be in that rural setting, that can be a significant external stressor on them. They've moved away from friends and family. So they might have to work a substantial number of hours to be able to support themselves financially. So they're struggling to fit in their time at the university, their clinical education, then their study on top of that, and the like. They may also have even, on top of that, physical and or mental health issues that could be having a significant influence on their ability to study and their ability to engage in their clinical education. And so having an appreciation for those influences on how a learner may become a challenging learner is quite considerable and really valuable. The last two here are more reflections on ourselves as educators, and it's actually getting us to think about our role in why someone might become a challenging learner for us and potentially for other educators at the same time. And it may be around this idea of it's actually us as the educator with providing very poor guidance, very poor supervision or oversight. Our teaching needs to be improved. And I've put in here in sort of quotation marks this idea of what the learner can get away with. One of the things that does come through the literature a little bit is learners, when they first arrive on a clinical placement, will often see what can they actually get away with on this placement? What can they push with you to get sort of everything ticked off, or to minimise the amount that they have to do to get all of those elements of this particular placement covered off so that they can go back to university and everything's done and dusted. And then finally is the inexperienced supervisor. And we always have some really inexperienced supervisors with us. We've all been in this scenario of being an inexperienced supervisor. And so it's one thing what we need to do is think about how might our role as just purely being inexperienced but wanting to get better may contribute to the development of the challenging learner. It's just we're not putting potentially in place the best strategies. We know that we need to, but we're not sure how. And so being able to work with a trusted colleague or mentor as a bit of a sounding board for this is a really effective strategy to help us develop as clinical educators, but also to try and help us with managing these challenging learners. So really what we've talked about here is a list of things that sort of we know from the literature and our practical experience as to why a learner may become a challenging learner. What we've sort of done is now divided those up into a slightly different way of looking at it. So this is really thinking about it from the point of view of the learner themselves. And so we've got these intrinsic ideas or intrinsic factors. We've also got these extrinsic factors that actually play a role in it too. And so what we've got is first of all, our intrinsic factors. So we've talked about potentially this lack of insight, them being the overall underconfident learner. There may be mental health influences, depression, anxiety that goes with this. The lack of interpersonal skill, that could certainly be a contributor to communication and professionalism issues. It could be contributing to why you're not able to interact with them appropriately or on a professional and educational level too. There may be that knowledge deficit. We've talked about the idea of language skills being part of that as well. Physical illness, so physically actually being affected by something at that particular time during their placement. Critical incidents, depending upon the type of placement that your learners are on. So in critical care type scenarios, that can be quite confronting being on a clinical placement, and particularly the early clinical placements where it's their first exposure to those high acuity type of environments can be quite a significant influence on why this learner might become a bit of a challenge and potentially even withdraw from their clinical education. Professionalism, we've talked a lot about professionalism and particularly how that ties into our learner with potentially a lack of insight. And then finally, one that we often don't consider is that the learner, this may not actually be the right career for this particular learner. They've been potentially pushed into it. They've got maybe family expectations that they go into a particular profession. They've sort of been pushed into it from friends or family, and it really just isn't for them. It's not their passion, so they're not going to engage with it at all. So talking about those intrinsic and extrinsic motivators, there's actually no intrinsic motivation for them to do this clinical education or their learning at all. So really, they're only going to do this to be able to tick the box to get through it and hopefully move into a career that they actually would like to do. The factors that are extrinsic to the learner themselves are some of those ideas that we've already talked about. So it's the quality and quantity of the supervision. So sometimes the quality of the supervision is not actually the issue. It's more so the quantity. We actually don't spend a lot of time with our learners. That can be a real issue because they're actually either not getting exposure to us from a role modelling standpoint and therefore their knowledge of the tasks, but they actually then don't get to see, as I said, us perform the task, but also for us to observe them performing the task and providing some feedback. Personality interactions do have a significant influence on this. The nature of the task can be a particularly interesting one, particularly if the task is well above their confidence and competence level at that particular point in time. They may be an early year clinical learner who actually hasn't done anything with respect to the knowledge and skills related to be able to perform that task in a clinical setting. So it's just way over their head for that point in time. The learning environment and the system sort of go hand in hand. So we've already talked about how systems play a big part in the learner becoming a challenge. It may be that they've got through this system really easily and it's actually the system sort of failed to pick them up. And then we've got this idea around the learning environment, not really creating whether it be a positive or a productive learning environment for these learners. So really what we've talked about there is a bit of a different way of framing all of those ideas we've talked about. And this is another table out of Yvonne Steinert's paper, which sort of really captures those ideas across these 6 areas. So knowledge, what's the gap? Where's the gap in the skill or their clinical knowledge in this? Their attitudes, then into their skill itself. So is it an interpersonal skill? Is it a technical skill? Is it the organisation? Is it the judgment? Is it us as the educator? What do we need to consider about the learner? And then what is it about the system that's having an influence on this as well? And again, even if you take those headings that are in grey and bold and think about those boxes underneath are blank, and if you're able to take it, that challenging learner that you're thinking about, I imagine that you'll actually be able to put a little bit of detail into each of those boxes about why that learner was a problem for you. And even as a bit of a reflection on today, is actually think about those 6 headings and what you would be able to put under those headings for a learner that you've had a challenge or you've found challenging. So we've sort of talked a bit about how they get to this point of being a challenging learner. So what are we going to do about it? We've talked about a few of the ideas, but one of the things I think we were talking about, particularly with yourself, Sarah, and Beck beforehand, was this idea of what do we do? Like, we keep trying stuff. We really want to make sure that they get through this placement, because we always feel it's a bit of a reflection on us if they don't do well on the placement or they fail. And we think that the best way of getting this learner through and really to make them a better health professional is to do more, and more. So you'll see the quote down the bottom here, which is, we give them more feedback, we give them more activities, and we give them more supervision. Now imagine for most of you that would resonate. That's what we've all done. The drawback with it is it's so time consuming and intensive for us as educators that we actually get exhausted by doing it. And so this is where taking the step backwards and using those questions that we've talked about before to go, what's the best strategy to manage this particular learner? And sometimes it's actually that they're actually way too far down the track. And so these tie back into our system issues we talked about before. And so the 2 ideas at the top of this slide are where are we at? So they're actually too far down the track, right? They've been able to get away with particular behaviours, or these behaviours actually just haven't been picked up, or their level of skill, clinical knowledge hasn't been picked up. And so they're actually coming to this placement completely under-equipped for it, but they should be able to do it based on the fact they're actually, in 6 weeks' time, they're actually going to be out there doing unsupervised clinical practice for themselves because they graduate. There's also this idea of failure to fail. I imagine most of you probably have a role in assessing the clinicians or the students that you're working with. What we often think is that this will become someone else's problem, number 1. Number 2, someone else will pick up that it's a problem. So we'll go, look, yeah, there's a bit of an issue with this, but if they go and do this, they'll probably be okay. The problem is we all say it. And so it keeps going down the line. And so what happens is the learner eventually gets to a point where all along they failed to fail. So no one's actually stopped them or pulled the reins up and said, actually, you know what, at this point in time, you need to go back and repeat these activities, or we need to take you back to really develop this knowledge and skill. They're at a point where sometimes it's actually just well beyond that, and there are far bigger things that we need to try and remediate. So the 2 take-homes out of that are, 1, actually don't be afraid to fail. There's actually a lot of value in doing it where it's warranted, of course, because it actually does help the learner. And a bigger influence is it does help the system as well. So this is one of the ways that you, as an educator, can influence the system. So let's go to how do we really address it? And the ideal is that we address it early. The earlier we can get it, the better. One of the things to think about is if your problem is really only covering one very small aspect of that learner's learning or their practice, how big a problem is it? Is it actually something that they're likely to develop as they go along through the rest of their learning? Or is it actually a problem because it's across multiple aspects of their performance in their practice? So it might be that you've got a learner who is struggling with their communication, but in other placements, they've actually been okay. So it might be just communication in that strategy. And so you can work with the learner really easily from a learning standpoint to help them develop that confidence and those skills and that knowledge to be able to learn those communication skills. If it's, for example, it's communication skills that blends into them doing their clinical skill, or some of the other challenge is that's when we become a bigger issue. What we need to do is also consider getting involved with the clinical placement coordinator, the subject coordinator really early. So making sure that if there is a problem, we make them aware that this is an issue, how we might be able to address it from our point of view as an educator, and potentially what sort of support that we might want from that particular learner, from that particular placement or subject coordinator. And it may be that we actually just need to flag it and that's enough. Or is it that there are actually other things that we need to put in place? So it might be that actually the learner could really benefit from accessing some of the counselling support through whether it be the health service or the university. Do they actually need to be working with the subject coordinator on a number of things? So this is where really bringing the subject coordinator in or that placement coordinator in early is really valuable and a really good support for you. It also helps around that idea of, if you remember in our table early on in the webinar, around that assurance and documentation process that we have to make sure that any problem that we do try and address with our learners is going to be for the benefit of the learner, and that we're doing it in such a way that we can really show that we're focusing on the learner to help them improve. Also being aware of that psychological burden on you as an educator. We do have a tendency to take on board quite a lot, particularly when our learners aren't performing or aren't performing like we would like them to, particularly if we've helped them quite a lot over that particular journey. And it may not be that it's actually probably not a reflection on us. It's more a reflection on some of those other factors that are underpinning that particular learner. And it may be some of those intrinsic or extrinsic factors that we talked about that we may just not actually be able to address, but we may be able to provide some support to those learners to go and access other parts or other services that are actually going to help then improve their performance. So if we think about very briefly how we might talk about examining or addressing some of these skills. So very briefly, what could be some take-homes out of today? So let's have a look. First up is this lack of knowledge around the standards, the goals, or the expectations. How could we address it? Ask the learner, what do they want to get out of this particular placement? What are their goals for it? What are their expectations? What's the university or the subject coordinator expecting them to get out of this placement? If they're really clear on that, it's probably going to be okay. You can always then, if you're starting to go down that path of asking the question of if it's a problem, where does it sit in relation to the standards or the expectations for this placement? If it can match up, then you've got something that you can address. And so it negates some of those other questions that we need to talk about. If the learner's not really sure, try and really encourage them to formulate some goals for what they want to get from this placement. And as long as they're realistic, that can also help frame their motivations and hopefully encourage their motivation to participate in their own learning. A lack of insight into their own behaviour. A really great way of doing this is to often have the learner observe you as the educator doing or role modelling the particular skills or behaviours that you want them to copy or to be able to emulate. Or you can get peers, particularly if you're in that lucky scenario where the learner is working with some other peers at their level. that display those particular behaviours or those particular skills in a positive light, having that problem or challenging learner reflect on what they see their peer doing can be really valuable. Lack of incentive is a little bit more challenging. So how do we build incentives into our placements? So this comes back to knowing what the learner's goals for this placement are. If it's just to tick the boxes to get through the placement, well, that's going to be a bit more of a challenge. So how do we build up the incentive for those learners? Where do they want to be? So what do they want to do when they finish? If it's that they just want to work with sports people, for example, or work with athletes, that's their only part of clinical practice. And again, you're in that aged care setting, then you might go, well, okay, the incentive for you here in this placement is actually around developing communication strategies to help get the best out of that particular client. And that's going to help you with dealing with your athlete when you're working with them from a health point of view. So there's often a way that you can build in some sort of motivation based on where it is they want to get to in their own career. Lack of knowledge or skill, again, these are probably a little bit easier to tackle because we can start developing learning activities or point them in the direction of resources that are going to help build up that knowledge, those skills. Again, it could be us as the educator role modeling those skills or those particular activities. A lack of opportunity to rehearse or practice. So there's two parts to this here. Is it that there is an opportunity to practice a particular skill or rehearse particular skill? Sometimes there may not be, and that's just because of the patient mix that we've got. There are definitely other times where there's an opportunity for that learner to be engaged in at least a part of that particular client or patient's care. And so even for our early year clinical learners, this is a really important part for them. And so often they will be able to contribute at least, even if it's just a small part to that patient's care. It might be just something as simple as them taking that particular patient or learner from the waiting room into the consultation room. That's their job. And that's going to be a fairly significant activity for that early year learner and hopefully build their confidence around communication, professionalism, helping to work with that learner, with that particular patient or client. So something as simple as that can be a really beneficial learning activity. And then having that insight into us as as educators, hugely important. We talked about those ideas. And so us participating in these types of workshops are really valuable as well. Lastly, for those of you that have done any work in the adolescent child health space, the HEADS framework is a way of sort of asking or trying to get a bit of an insight into some of the issues that come up that might be extrinsic to their learning, full stop. So we're talking here about home life, external influences around family, their social supports, and so on. If you want to know a little bit more about those, then there's some really good resources that the Children's Hospital provides actually around that, around some great questioning that you can use. But sometimes a reasonably useful way of framing some of our thought processes to think, well, okay, what parts might externally influence why this learner is a challenge? So we talked about the idea of getting in early. So early being day dot, when we first meet this learner, getting to know them as much as possible within that professional learning context. What are the opportunities for them to learn? Are there opportunities that match with their goals for themselves as a learner and as a developing health professional? What's going to be your role in helping them? What are you able to role model for them? What do you want to role model for them? What would you expect them to be able to do? Then orientating the learner to the placement. And again, this is an idea that we see coming through, particularly in the feedback literature, but I think there's a really good application of this into the broader clinical placement itself. What's going to happen? What are the things that they will get experienced or get exposure to? So we talk about this idea of teaching on the run. Ideally, everything that we do in that placement is a teaching opportunity and a learning opportunity for that particular learner. And sometimes we actually have to be really explicit and flag that. So really what we're building up here is this, this idea of, one, us as a model and a role model, but two, the idea that there's this intrinsic motivation. They can learn from everything that they see in front of them. For those of you that are involved in teaching in critical care scenarios, that can be a little more challenging. And so there's still opportunities to flag what might the learner see in this scenario that you want them to focus on. There's always going to be a take-home message out of everything that we see. Where are they going to get to at the end of this placement? So what's your vision for where they will end up? And that can be really helpful for us as the educator as well, because it gives us a really good idea about where we need to make sure that we're going to when we're working with these learners. What sort of feedback are they going to have access to? Is it they're going to get feedback from you? So feedback on their performance. How are they performing? And get it really early. How do they access it? Are you happy for them to come and ask you for their feedback or for some feedback on their performance on an ongoing basis? Is it you're going to do it at lunchtime, at the end of the day? Is it they've got peers that they can draw on who can give them feedback as well? So you can see all of these are really early ideas that we want to talk to our learners early on, get them into this idea that they're actually going to learn a lot by being in this placement. Regardless of what it is that they want to do in their practice, they're going to get something from it. And it's to really build into this intrinsic motivation. And often some of these strategies will often head off this idea of the learner becoming a challenge because they know what they're going to learn, how they're going to learn it, where their feedback is coming from, and what are the strategies that they can go away, do themselves, and what they're going to be supported in to do better with. So the idea is really, again, really sort of taking those ideas and thinking back to some of the early conversation. We can't assume that they're confident or competent either. We can design challenge activities related to their learning goals. Where are they actually at? So are there particular activities that you know that they're going to do in this placement, but you're not sure whether they're going to be able to cope with it? Okay. Try it out, but try it out in a really supported setting. To like frame it around, we're going to try and help you build to this point. This is the goal. This is where we're going to get you to by the end of this placement. It also may help you identify those issues around mental health. It could be a knowledge issue, English language or English as a second language. It could also be confidence. Then you can target what it is you're going to do to help the learner get to that endpoint. Really making sure that you're going back to what the learner set as those explicit links every single time. Then what are you going to allow the learner to go away and do? Right? With this idea of minimal supervision. Where are they going to be able to get to by the end of their placement? You can go, yep, if you went away and took a history from that client, I'd be really happy for you to do that. And you could do that with pretty much every client. Ideally, that's really where we like to get our learners to. We talked about documenting what you need to do. And so really these are some overarching strategies more than anything else. And so talking about the purpose, the strategies and the resources that we're putting in place, and then the goals. How do we bring it together? That's a bit of our summary, really all these ideas that we've talked about. Main thing is that the last point there is remember your safety, that of your patients, and that of your learners as well. Goal setting, we've talked about as well. So I'm going to leave you with some of the references that are there. A little bit of a plug for our upcoming course as well. And so if you're interested in doing a bit more around clinical education, this is a really good course to get you into the swing of it. The link's there. You'll have access to this in the video, and feel free to get in contact with us as well if you're interested in that program. We've got a little bit of an evaluation. We'd love you to be involved in that evaluation. Give us your feedback on this course and this particular webinar especially. And finally, thank you. We're pretty much bang on 2 o'clock now, so unfortunately we've probably run out of time for questions, but if you do have any other questions, feel free to send me an email, ask any questions that you've got. If you've got issues with particularly challenging learners that you want to address, feel free to get in contact and we can try and work you through it. But I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Hopefully that's been really useful for you, and look forward to being able to, hear you go, how you go with your challenging learners, and to be able to chat with you soon.
Thanks, Brett.
Thanks.